Hi there. This is Ron Gula with the Gula Tech Cyber Fiction show. Today, our guest is Dr. Eric Cole. And before we get to the good Dr. Cole, we have a couple shout outs. So, first of all, if you've seen this man, Bryson Board is going to get his beard shaved April 10th, which is just a week from now. And we are going to do it to raise money for a good cause. So if you're not following me on Twitter, I'm at Ron Gula, and you can register for the Great Shave, as we're calling it, next week. I also am wearing Godzilla because I'm a big Godzilla fan. Godzilla versus King Kong is out, but I'm also wearing Tenable Network security shirt. Tenable was recently named as a finalist for this year's SC Magazine, a couple different awards that are coming out there. And so I wish them great luck with that, and hope everybody at Tenable is doing really, really well. All right, well, on with the show. Eric, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for coming out today. So, when was the last time we met?
I think we met probably 20 something years ago, but I think the last time in person was probably 3 or 4 years ago at a security conference.
It was either a SANS conference. You did it at Ions for a while bit,
Yes.
and then there was the conference in Myrtle Beach that we were talking about earlier that we could not remember the name of that. So
You're like a forensics conference or
yes,
something along those
yes,
lines.
absolutely, absolutely. So for people who aren't familiar with you, what's your background? You have in your LinkedIn page that you worked at the CIA. I think we all started out in Intel or DoD, but tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I've been doing cybersecurity for 30 years. And as you mentioned, I started off at the CIA as a professional hacker for 8 years. So essentially learning how to identify vulnerabilities, how to identify exploits. And I'll tell you, after working at the CIA for 8 to 9 years, I figured out two things. One, offense is boring because you always get in, right? One of the golden rules of cybersecurity is when you add functionality, you always decrease security. So I switched my career focusing on the defense. And the other thing I realized why I love working at the government, I don't like working for other people. So I also sort of started my career as an entrepreneur where I then built up a company, TSGI, that we sold to Lockheed Martin. And then Bob Stevens, the CEO of Lockheed, kept me on as their chief scientist. So I handled all cybersecurity issues and breaches and acquisitions for about 8 years. Then I got recruited by McAfee, and I was their CTO to redesign their entire product line. And then we had the company acquired by Intel for several bill. And then after that, I decided, hey, I got one or two more in me. So I started Secure Anchor, where I'm really focused on strategic cybersecurity and helping organizations build roadmaps with a keen focus on training up chief information security officers so they could really understand and integrate security into the business.
That's awesome. So let's talk about that a little bit more. So Lockheed Martin, you're there as the cybersecurity senior cybersecurity person for like the mid 2000s or so. That's about that time frame.
Correct. It was from 2003 to 2007.
And when I think of Lockheed Martin, I think of missiles and airplanes. But what do they do in cyber? Like why do they have a cyber person such as yourself on stage on staff?
Yeah. It's really to protect all of their intellectual property. If you think about sort of one of the ones they were known for when the Chinese breached their fighter jet in order to get some of the new information and details about how the radar systems worked. Because think about it, if a foreign adversary can understand how our radar system is working for the brand new fighter jet, they could design ways to bypass or get around it. So a lot of the focus was really on the protection of the intellectual property and making sure that the critical information, contract data, and other information, since most of their work was for the government, was properly protected, secured, and locked down. And probably not surprising, and I see this even with a lot of companies today, but in the mid 2000s, cybersecurity was always an afterthought. It's design and build the solution. And then at the very end, let's throw a few technology on there, add it on, and that's all you need for security. And as you know, it's really about integrating security into the design process. So one of the big things at Lockheed Martin that I did was I required that any new project, when they did their kickoff design and their estimates for the project, that security was present at the meeting and that security requirements were presented at the same time the initial design build was put in place.
Excellent. So now you're at Secure Anchor, and what are some of the services that you are providing to clients and people these days?
So at Secure Anchor, there's three core services. One is CISO certification, because I think that's a big gap, really helping to train, coach, and get CISOs that actually can understand the business. The second one, which is tied to that, is building out effective security roadmaps for organizations. I know a lot of companies like to have their pen tests, their security assessments, and others, but what I find is they hire a company, they get an 800-page report, and it sits on a shelf and nothing happens with it. So we do an assessment with a twist where we build out a roadmap based on the understanding of their business that's integrated into the business that their team can follow. And then the third one is expert witness, where I testify in high-profile cases to typically intellectual property, data breaches, or trade secrets.
If the packet fits, you must acquit, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
Exactly. I love that.
All
I'm
right.
going to use that one.
So, let's talk a little bit about this CISO certification. And a lot of people that listen to the show and watch the show, are trying to get into cybersecurity, and they might dream someday of being maybe a cyber entrepreneur, but they also think about being a chief information security officer. So, why do we need a certification for that type of role?
To me, the reason we need a certification is because it's different than being a security engineer. And a perfect example of that is we do a lot of social media, and I'm putting out information on our CISO cert. And one of my favorite comments was somebody posts and goes, "Dr. Cole, you are clearly naive. You cannot teach people how to be a CISO. The only way to be a CISO is be a security engineer for 12 years, threaten to leave the company if they don't promote you, and get the CISO title." And I sort of read that. I was like, because that's the problem. Now, there are cases where world-class security engineers, if they do a mind shift, can become a world-class CISO. But the problem is world-class security engineers that are super technical typically don't make good CISOs because it's completely different. And a great example is, and this is sort of my CISO test, you're sitting at your desk, and all of a sudden you get a text that one of your servers been compromised. One of your systems has been broken into. What do you do? If your answer is, I immediately run into the data center, or I immediately, if you're working from home, connect into the system with SSH, analyze, look at what's going on, analyze the logs, determine the extent of damage, determine the extent of compromise, congratulations. You're a world-class security engineer. You would make an awful CISO. On the other hand, if you said, well, the first thing I would do is get my team together, I would start to task them saying, look at this, check those logs. I would then say, get back to me in 45 minutes. I immediately call the CEO of the company and give them an update and say, I'll get back to you in an hour. You would be a world-class CISO. But it's a completely different mindset. CISOs are focused on the business, and world-class security engineers are focused on technology and technical solutions.
What's the quote that you have on Twitter and LinkedIn? A CISO is not a technical job.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, the CISO is not a technical career path for security engineers.
But it does help, but it also does hinder this people conversation. And I spend a lot of time trying to educate people getting into this business, and I tell them, like, 90% of the time you're talking to people who aren't technical.
Right.
So you need to be able to learn how to communicate. So I'm kind of curious, in the CISO certification, how much, business stuff is in there, how much communication stuff in there? Do you have like the Myers-Briggs test? Do you have that kind of, what kind of CISO makes a good CISO? What kind of person makes a good CISO?
So yes, a lot of people are a little shocked when they get into the CISO cert because it's 40 hours of knowledge transfer, and then there's a coaching component and a private community where you can interact. But of the 40 hours, only 7 of it is on security technology. There's 20 hours of it on business, mindset, asking the right questions. For example, if you're a CISO, you must be able to read a balance statement. You must know what a profit and loss is. You must understand how the business is making money. And I know at first people are shocked with me, but think about it. If you don't know how much money the company is making in both revenue and profit, how do you know how much to spend on security? If you don't know which products or business lines are bringing in the higher profit margins, how can you align security to properly protect the critical data? So we actually teach a lot. I sort of call it a mini MBA. And then the other part that I find really important is mindset. When I talk to a lot of folks, they're like, Eric, I could never be a CISO. No one's going to trust me. Executives are never going to talk to me. And I go, whether you think you can or think you can't, you're probably right. So to me, you got to believe and trust yourself, because when you're sitting in front of a CEO, If you sit there and look at the CEO going, listen, I don't know business and I don't know, you're done, right? You got to have that confidence, not arrogance, but confidence to understand what the business really is and then integrate security in. But when you're talking as a CISO to executives, it's dollars and cents. One of my favorite little tricks is when you're talking to executives, there's only four things you need to worry about. What is the risk? Likelihood of occurring, cost if it occurs, and cost to fix it. If you're talking false positives, firewalls, and IDSs, you're in technical geek land and they are not understanding what you're saying.
So I really like that. And there's products out there that can kind of help people do this kind of risk and financial modeling, right? You have loss of revenue. If you have
Yep.
the server that books the airline tickets, right? If you're doing $1 million a day and that goes down for 3 days, if I can do the math right, that's a $3 million loss, right? If you lose, data in California, you might have financial loss from regulatory and compliance compromises, right? So do you teach people kind of how to pull all that apart, put it on a spreadsheet, put it on a PowerPoint, and present that to the board, present that to the CEOs?
Exactly. It's all about understanding the business. When we do security assessments, it always shocks everyone because when we go on site to perform our security assessment, the first thing we do when we get there is we sit down with the CFO and I want to understand the financials of the business. And that's so backwards because most security assessments are all about everything else. Because to me, if I can understand the financials, I can understand what the business lines are. And what I want to understand is how the company makes money, what their margins are, and what differentiates them from the competition. Then, based on that, we're then going to say, okay, what's the biggest risk to the organization? Is it loss of confidentiality, which most people always think about? Most security professionals are all about protect the data from disclosure, but actually, in a lot of cases, integrity and availability are more important. We just got hired by a company that does a large number of the COVID tests, and they grew by 400%. As a business owner, you'll appreciate this. 2019, they made 21 million in revenue. In 2020, they made 370 million in revenue. Yet they had no security in place, and their folks are all about PHI and encrypting the data. And I looked at them, I said, okay, if some of the patient testing data gets out in the public, can you survive? And they said yes. I said, if you start screwing up patient records and give the wrong test results to the wrong people, can you survive? And they're like, well, it's get a little questionable. And then I said, if you can't run your test results for 3 or 4 days, can you survive? And they say, we go out of business. So right there, you saw that their priority was actually quite backwards. So our main focus was how do we keep the availability and integrity? And then the confidentiality, why important, actually came in a distance third. It wasn't the top priority.
Now, a lot of these customers you're working with are large enterprise, right? 20 million, 100 million more in revenue, right? Is that kind of correct?
Yes, so our sweet spot in the market is what I call a small to medium. So about 200 million to 2 billion
Hmm.
that has IT and they have somebody on the team that does security, but they typically don't have a CISO or a security department, and they need someone to help them understand or integrate security into the IT and business process.
Excellent. Uh, so for a lot of those big organizations, how many of them are dominated by, HIPAA, by PCI, or they kind of say, hey, we want to be compliant with like DoD standards, like the risk management framework, the DISA STIGs, that kind of stuff.
Most of the ones we get involved with, you're exactly right. There's a compliance drive, that there's a regulation drive. Somebody in the organization, usually legal, goes to the executive team and says, hey, there's this new regulation or this regulation we've been ignoring, and we need to go in and pay attention to it. And one of the things I always joke with my engineers is when we do assessment work, you want to give them what they ask for, but provide what they really need. So they're asking to be regulatory compliant, but in reality, you can be compliant with regulation and still vulnerable and still compromised and still broken into. So what we try to do is say, okay, we're going to give you what you asked for, get you compliant, but then we're going to also do it in a way that you're actually secure, protected, and your critical data is managed, understood with the proper process flows.
That's excellent. How often are you using tools like the NIST Cybersecurity Framework or Sunil use Cyber Defense Matrix? Have you seen those?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I would say sort of a yes. So what we do is we have what we call a proprietary method, but essentially it's a combination of all of them. So when I was at SANS, I built the critical controls. We have the NIST, we have the risk framework. So what we do is we take pieces from all of those and say, okay, what really is the core functionality across all of them, and then focus in on those core areas, and then we sort of build out domains to focus on. Like, for example, all of them on one way or another are really about asset inventory configuration management. So that's one area. Another one that's sort of integrated in, but I think is probably the most important, is critical data. Most of these breaches we've seen out there, from large hotels to healthcare, what does it all come down to? There was critical data on servers that they didn't know about. So if you can get better control and visibility of your data and know where it is and manage it, then a lot of these problems start to go away or get minimized very quickly.
That's well said. We had Tony Sager on the show, and he kind of talked
Oh, yeah.
about his work early in the early days of the NSA when he was trying to get that. What's the core of most of these common security compliance frameworks, and also what they're doing at the Center for Internet Security right now. Do you get pushback? Do you get people saying, "Look, I really want to protect my employees from IP theft from China, but I don't know why we're having two-factor control or these things are encrypted twice." Like, what kind of pushback do you get from non-cyber people?
Yeah, that's always the thing that comes back, is where they want security, but they want it easy. Right? They don't want it to get in the way. So one of the big things that I really push is, to me, if you do it correctly, cybersecurity should be a business enabler. It should really be done in a way that increases the effectiveness of the business. So, for example, at one of the hospitals we were working with, the doctors were like, we're not doing two factor. It's not going to happen. I mean, they were fighting it. There was a couple attempts that failed. So what we did is we understood how they did their work. And now what we actually do is a biometric proximity. In hospitals, you must have a badge. If you don't have a badge, you're not getting in, because the physical security, the swipe. So they are trained already on carrying their badges everywhere. So what we did is we just upgraded their badges to have a proximity device. So when you're within 6 feet of a machine, it unlocks. And when you're 6 feet away, it gets disabled. Now, of course, people could steal badges, but in hospitals, if you lose your badge, you got bigger problems, because somebody can get into sensitive areas, ICU and others. So they already have that piece taken care of. So we just adapted our security. We didn't do two-factor in the traditional way, where you have an RSA token. We did two-factor with a proximity badge, and now it's increased the security. A lot of their issues went away, and the doctors love it because we enable them to be more successful. So to me, it's about, how can you be creative and not just follow the set rule book, but understand the business and say, how can we align it to make it easier and simple for people to be secure?
Excellent. So outside a large enterprise, when you start talking to smaller companies, people who don't have a CISO and a compliance staff and that sort of thing, I often find it hard to convey all the complexities of cyber because we have to simplify things. So what do you kind of advice do you give for small business? You know, the donut shops, the dentists, the movie theaters, that type of thing. How do you tell them to go about life?
I know some security people get very upset when I say this, so I'll give the answer and then I'll give my caveat with it. Outsource it. Give it over to third parties. There's great companies out there that can manage secure. I'm a big proponent of the cloud, especially for smaller companies. Now, here's the thing you got to be careful of. A lot of really good security people, we're trained to look for the problem. We're trained to look for the fault. So I go in to these smaller companies and say, outsource everything to the cloud. And immediately you have security people going, oh, but Eric, there's this vulnerability, there's this vulnerability, there's this vulnerability. Yes, but that's the wrong comparison. If you're taking a solution and you're ripping it apart for all the vulnerabilities, you're assuming that the current way you're doing things is 100% secure. And that's the fallacy. What I always say is, okay, moving to the cloud and giving all of your data, information, email to a third party to secure, run, and lock down does have risks. But compared to what a small donut shop is doing today, where they running their own data center while they're making donuts, that solution is a whole lot better than what you have. So to me, cybersecurity is not about perfection. There's always going to be issues and challenges. It's about always improving security. And if you're small and you can't have your own staff, giving it to a third party. Now, you want to make sure you use a good third party, but there's a lot of great cloud providers out there that will take care of most of the work so you don't have to worry about it.
I think that's well said. The Cyber Readiness Institute, they've got four things they recommend, right? No USB, well, use clean USBs, have strong passwords, authentication, two-factor, patch your stuff, and then do education on phishing. And I've always thought that that was really good. There's like 20 other things you can
Yep.
do, but if you're not doing those four, it's tough. And I definitely agree with this, use cloud services, but we got to talk about SolarWinds and Dark Halo here, right? So we all said, hey, let's outsource to the cloud. We all put our email on Office 365, and a lot of people only used one password to administer that, and they're getting taken over left and right. What are your comments on that?
So two comments on that. First one is you can outsource email, you can outsource technology, you can outsource security. You can't outsource liability. So you still have to sit back and say, what is our liability? But if we look at with the Microsoft issue, the problem with that is they have a lot of good security that's not turned on by default, because we're still in that stage where when I talk to a lot of Microsoft folks, they go, Eric, some consumers want it, so we build it in, but not enough require it that if we turn it on, we'll lose a competitive advantage. So if you went in to Office 365 and you turned on all the proper security and you turned on the two-factor and the notifications, those attacks would have been detected, reduced, and minimized. So the problem is the security is there, but we still have to take a responsibility to turn that on and monitor and track. And then with the SolarWinds, to me, companies and the government broke a fundamental rule. One of our fundamental rules is when you have any third-party connections into your network or third-party servers, those must be segmented and isolated on a separate VLAN. I remember when I was teaching security 18 years ago, that was one of the fundamental rules, but we tend to break that rule, not follow it. The other fundamental rule that I teach is inbound prevention, outbound detection. You got to be monitoring all outbound activity and see where it's going. And that's how it was ultimately caught. But most companies are not looking at the outbound traffic. They're not monitoring it. So to me, this was sort of a wake-up call that even though it looks like it came from advanced adversaries, to me, this attack wasn't advanced, and some people get mad at me, but this was preventable if we followed some of the fundamental rules.
Yeah. So a couple things to unpack there. So the first one is that we talk about patching systems and, keeping things updated. But a lot of times, if you're running 100% Microsoft shop or 100% Apple shop, which you can do, you can buy 100% Apple products, 100% Microsoft products. As soon as you bring in Zoom, as soon as you bring in Adobe, as soon as you bring it, you kind of turn off some basic defenses. So I often thought that the cyber folks who just trying to say yes to everything, we often don't say, hey, look, it might be okay just to use Teams. It might be okay to do that. So what are your thoughts on kind of running with the monoculture because it's easier to defend, it's easier to look and manage?
So I'm very big on security of helping the business and helping them be successful. But there's a difference between helping and enabling the business and just saying yes to random stuff. So what I always do when we do CISO or vCISO type work is when somebody comes and says, hey, we want to use Zoom. I come back and say, what is the problem you're trying to solve? Well, we got to have Zoom. No, what is the problem? Well, I need to be able to do video conferencing with our different clients. Great. We currently have XYZ solution for doing that. Why isn't that working for you? Well, I prefer Zoom. Well, yes, everyone prefers different things, but can you try our solution for 45 days? And this has been checked, verified, and validated, and see if that works for you. And then if not, let us know specifically what's not working, and we'll come up with a solution for you. Now, of course, you're always going to get some folks that just, they're going to cross their arms and have a temper tantrum, which is okay. But to me, I find that diffuses a lot of it, where when you say, what is the problem you're trying to solve? Don't come to me with the solution. Come to me with the problem, and then we'll start to figure it out. And there has to be rules and organizations. If you allow everything to happen across every platform, it's going to get out of control. So if you go in and you've agreed that you're going to use solution X, then guess what? That has to be the solution. And if people don't like it, you take it to the board. But this whole idea of exception management or shadow IT, to me is probably one of the most dangerous things in organizations if you don't get a handle on it very quickly.
Now, the second thing you mentioned was VLANs. But before we go into VLANs, let's just kind of take an overview, and we're going to say some architecture terms here called like zero trust and segmentation and whatnot. I think a lot of people are familiar with the concept of two phones, like your personal phone and your work phone. And your work phone might be on your same home Wi-Fi, but maybe it's got VPN connectivity to Office, doesn't have Facebook on it, it's got authorized apps. We kind of lose that when we go into the world of laptops and home networks and whatnot. So give us some thoughts on VLANing, zero trust, segmentation, all that type of stuff.
So to me, what it really comes down to is, especially everything that happened with the epidemic, is we have to have an architecture that's location agnostic, where people can work any place, anywhere, anytime. So one of my favorite questions is, I was talking with the CISO of a large financial institution in New York in January, and I said, how many new offices did you open in 2020? It's like, Eric, we closed down 7 offices. We didn't open up any new offices. We restricted access. So we actually shut down a lot of our functioning. I said, whoa, whoa, whoa. How many people do you have working from home in 2020 that weren't previously working from home? He looks it up and he says 33,000. So I said, you opened up 33,000 new, and it was like the eye where he never thought about it that way. But we have all these offices out there. So to me, the old concept of architecture, VLAN, and all that is sort of going away, where now the new architecture I'm pushing is a 3-tier model where you have all of your data in the cloud. Now, it can be public, private, hybrid, but your data is controlled and managed in one spot. You then have a robust authentication tier where now all connections to that data, you have 2-factor geolocation validation, and you have anomaly detection. Because most of these attacks, you have somebody who's logging in every day from 8 in the morning till 5 in the United States, and when their account gets compromised, it's somebody from a foreign country. So if you're just doing the basic correlation behavioral analytics, you can catch a lot of the attacks. So you have that middle tier there. And then this is the big change on the endpoint, thin clients. I know we've talked about it for a while, but we can have 4 terabyte hard drives uncontrolled with outdated operating systems. So to me, when you're moving to that model, we're really getting away from having a robust internal architecture with VLAN segmentation. And now what we're saying is every single person is isolated and separate. You get new operating systems, and there's always authentication to get to the servers. And the thing that I laugh about it is I've been recommending, and I know you have too, for a long time, but now all of a sudden, wait, we got to use the cool term zero trust, right? To me, that's always been a but we're now given cool names
it's just,
to the same.
So I'll just kind of talk about this. One of our advisors for our foundations, Tom Quinn, he's the CISO of T. Rowe Price. And I was asking him about, like, do we need a zero trust product? Do we need things to make this? He goes, look, we just kind of design our network to do this, right? It's always been like this. You have least privilege, you have segmentation, you have the authentication, and it's good. But one thing I want to dig into is this concept of a thin client, because on one hand, you've got a complex operating system, laptop, Windows, Apple OS X, that sort of thing. That's not really a thin client. But on the other hand, you have closed systems like Chromebooks and Apple, iPads and stuff. But then you also can have little, I say little, virtual machines that can run on your endpoint and give you like remote access into Windows things. So when you say thin client, just expand that for a little bit more. What do you really want on that endpoint?
Excellent. So what I want when I talk about thin client is no big hard drive for data storage. So in the ideal situation with a thin client, you turn it on in the morning and it goes out to a trusted site that verifies and validates, and it pulls down the entire operating system and runs it in memory. So now what you're doing is, instead of having a laptop that has a 4 terabyte hard drive, you now have 64 gig of memory because you're running the entire operating system there. Now, if you have some locations that are slower speed and it's going to take 2 or 3 hours to do that, you could have a small hard drive that caches the operating system and you only pull it down on the weekend when it's slower. But the 3 problems we're trying to solve with thin clients is, first, no local data storage. Because if you're storing data locally, you're opening up to ransomware attacks, you lose control of your data, things can leak out very quickly. Second thing, we're trying to do is really make sure it's up to date and patched. So now if you're getting a new operating system every day or every week, now it's being patched, it's being updated, it's being locked down. To me, probably the biggest thing on the thin client model is now when you get compromised, the length of time is greatly reduced. When you have a traditional hard drive with a 4 terabyte hard drive and the OS installed, you get compromised 6 months into it and you're compromised for 2 years.
Because nobody reboots those computers and all that kind of. Now, how about remote desktop? So it's
Yep.
one thing to have a thin client. What do you think about remote desktop, where I can maintain my pristine computers on my cloud, on my private secure VLAN, and give people the illusion of here's your Windows desktop, here is your OS X desktop? How do you feel about that?
If you can get the training issue under control where you can train people how to use it, then it's great. The reason why I do the thin client model when you're talking about doctors, lawyers, marketing, salespeople, thin client looks just like their operating system. There's no different. When you're talking about remote desktop, there's a couple of extra steps that you have to go through. So as long as you can get that training piece under control and people can understand how to do it, same type of solution.
That's excellent. And then just the last kind of thought on that, a lot of people, when you bring up, thin clients, hardened remote desktop, they also say, well, what about my Chromebook? What about my Microsoft Surface? What about my Apple iPad? Isn't that more secure? Because I don't have like a lot of local storage on it, everything's in the cloud. How do you feel about that?
So today, where you're looking at most of the attacks are opportunity attacks. So they're sending out a phishing message about COVID or a FedEx package to hundreds of thousands of people, hoping that 10 or 15% click on it. So today, 90% of what we've seen attacks are focused on Windows operating system. So if you use a non-Windows operating system like a Linux or an Apple, it's not more secure because they have vulnerabilities still, but they're less targeted and therefore a little safer. So what I do and all my clients do is we have a Windows system for doing work for clients because everybody uses Word and PowerPoint. You got to be consistent. However, the two most dangerous operations, checking email and surfing the web, we always do on iPads. So I always carry an iPad with me, and when I need to check email or do research, that's always on the iPad. This way, if it's malicious, we can catch it and track it beforehand. I clean out all the bad stuff, and then once I know it's good, I then use my Windows computer. So it's really having these two devices to separate and minimize the risk.
Awesome. All right. So I think we've eviscerated the zero trust architecture. Let's throw out a couple other ones. I'm just going to say a couple ones. You mentioned anomaly detection earlier. Let's talk about anomaly detection, but then segue into artificial intelligence.
So human beings are creatures of habit. We do things a certain way in a certain pattern. I'm sure if we went in and looked at your morning routine and you told me what you did today, I could probably predict what you've done for the last 3, 4, or 5 weeks, right? But most of us have very strict habits. So when you're looking at how we use a computer, there's very clear patterns of how somebody operates, when they log in, where they log in, what they do, what they access. So what I found is people give it all crazy words, but if you're just building a profile of normalcy and then anything that deviates from that, you go in and alert on, you can catch a lot of these attacks. Well, one of the big breaches we just worked on a couple of weeks ago, where a healthcare organization had 100,000 records stolen. Everyone that logs in to that company is in the United States. The attacker came from overseas. So if they just did some basic geolocation, they would have been able to catch that type of attack. So that's what I'm
Or even prevent it.
or even
Yeah.
prevent it.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's really what I'm looking at is just let's understand what's happening. Let's get a little more visibility, and any of those outliers, let's start doing a better job of catching, locking down, and preventing.
Yeah. So if I may, and we'll get into AI in a second, like I asked. So this anomaly detection, this is really what people refer to as hunting. It's one thing to load up for bad signatures and malware
Yeah.
and bad indications of compromise. But once you get past that, like SolarWinds, there were no indications of compromise, right? But there was anomalies about outbound connections, about how SolarWinds was behaving and stuff like that. So when I start thinking about large enterprise and even small business, when you're outsourcing IT, a lot of people, they ask, do you have security? And they point to their antivirus or a firewall. I want to educate people that they need to ask people to hunt. They need to look for anomalies. They need to look for these things because a doctor is not going to do this. and a hospital staff might not have those kind of things. I like to talk about this in terms of something I call the cyber poverty line.
Yeah.
That hunting is a key part of that. So,
Yeah, yeah, spot on. And to me, it's the switch. So everyone talks about incident response. Incident response is reactive. It's indicative on there's something visible. So when we go back 20 years ago and you had I love you, Melissa, visible things on the network, incident response was great. Today, it doesn't work because there's nothing visible. Today's attackers are covert. So I always say, and it's once again buzzwords, I call it proactive incident response, which is what you call threat hunting, where you actively hunt and look for those anomalies. And one of my favorite things where I've gone into companies that have been compromised for 2 or 3 years and I catch the attack within 20 minutes by doing this simple exercise. Take the outbound traffic, geolocate it on a map of the world, and use heat maps. So the more data, the thicker the connection. And then go to your executive team and say, okay, where are your clients and where do you do business? So I go in and I do this heat map where you have all these lines going to the east and to the west, to certain countries. I'm always careful about, I don't want to act like I'm naming, but we know who we're talking about, certain countries out there. And I present that to the execs and they go, Eric, we don't do any work in this country. We don't do any work in that. Yet 30-40% of their traffic's going there and we catch the attack and able to stop it very quickly. And they give us a lot of credit and we're known in the field for doing this, but I'm laughing going, why are you paying me all this money when you could have done the, I mean, your team could have produced the heat map. The software's cheap or free. Why are you paying us? Now, my team gets mad when I say this because I'm not trying to put us out of business, but these are things that you should be doing internally. You don't have to hire contractors or security experts to do some of the basics.
and you can even do that geolocation in the States. You can do it by zip code. That's so
Yes.
accurate
Yep.
these days. You can even break it down. This is a cell phone IP address. This is an Amazon data center. You can cross-reference it with stuff like Shodan.
Yep.
A lot of work to be done out there. So if you're not doing it, you might have something going on right now. You never really know. So anomaly detection, you're measuring something. You're measuring logins, activity, email, browsing the web, and you're looking for outliers.
Yes.
And that's also a way to understand what's on your network. I consider it's a form of like asset discovery. What's normal, right? If you don't know what's normal, you can't really figure out, what's abnormal. But how do we then get into artificial intelligence? Where are we right now? Is that something that we can use? Is it something in the products? What's your experience with AI over the last 30 years?
So interesting you say that because when I was starting at the agency, I didn't cover this because it wasn't cybersecurity. My first job was actually a programmer where we actually built AI systems to do predictive analysis. So when they were tracking certain individuals and wanted to predict what their behavior would be, I got all of the data and built out neural networks and expert systems to do that. So to me, AI is great if you have good, accurate data sets in which it doesn't change or get modified. One of the concerns, especially with neural networks in cybersecurity, is we don't have those clean data sets because it's always changing, always modifying, always updating. Now, I do believe that expert systems, rule-based systems, where you can take, okay, what are the steps an expert takes to perform things and implement that. But I feel like in cybersecurity that AI has sort of got overhyped a little bit where, oh, AI solves world hunger. Just call it AI. Just say you're different and people buy it. But once again, I come back to what are you really doing that's different? And let's put the proof in the pudding. So what I always tell everyone is if you have a new technology where they're claiming to do AI or some other great methodologies, go ahead and sign the PO, but ask them for a 30-day trial. Because if their product really works and does what it's supposed to, then they're willing to back it up. And if they're not willing to back up their product and give you a 30-day trial, you might want to think about, okay, is the product really going to deliver on what they're saying?
And you would like to think that there's at least 30,000 organizations that have been exploited with Exchange or SolarWinds, depending on how you count it, and had all sorts of endpoint and perimeter. I think IronNet claimed that they kind of caught some of that. Some of the other folks kind of rushed to, hey, we found this. Maybe they didn't know what it was because they find a part of it. But I always like to ask people who pitch me AI solutions, what have you found to date? Like, were you involved in that? All right. So we did zero trust. We did artificial intelligence. Now let's talk a little bit about insider threat. What is that? how much does cyber people, as cybersecurity people, are we worried about insider threat? What's been your experience with that term and people's feelings on it?
To me, insider threat is just inherent to how attacks work. So, one of the things I always say is if you look at almost all attacks, the source of almost all attacks are external. The cause of damage when almost all attacks are internal. So when I look at insider threat, even though at the agency we had Aldrich Ames, Robert Hansen, right? Everyone thinks insider threat, deliberate malicious insider, somebody who's going to actively try to bypass. And once again, if you have a malicious actor inside your organization and they're really good, it's really hard to catch them unless they screw up. But what I always said, because I worked on the Aldrich James case, the way you catch bad actors is they're going to either get greedy or brag. I mean, Aldrich James, he was making $30,000 a year, and he's showing up like a pimp with a fur coat, diamond rings, a new jacket. It's like, dude, paying attention. I mean, if he would have kept his profile low, maybe they would have never caught it. So people are always thinking about that deliberate malicious insider. To me, insider threat is broader. It's accidental, inadvertent insider, somebody who clicks on a link, somebody who opens an attachment, somebody who does something that causes damage. Well, if you think about it, that's pretty much all client-based attacks. So to me, even though I wrote a book many years ago, Insider Threat, today insider threat is just one of the two target vectors. You have servers are one target, and that's where the configuration management and patching and control of data comes in. And you have the endpoint, which is really all about insider threats, insiders doing things. So to me, if you're not doing insider threat, which is the cause of almost all damage, you're creating huge vectors that the adversary can exploit.
So I definitely agree that if I compromise an employee's laptop or, resources, I'm now them and I'm the insider. But the hunting for the next Edward Snowden, is an interesting thing. There's a lot of people putting a lot of resources into that. They're getting HR involved, they're getting physical security involved. And this goes back to your CISO, you got to be good talking to people. It's not just about the ones and zeros on the computers. It's the business risk. And I think it's interesting that a lot of people are bringing HR into these things to look at folks. All right, good. All right, so I'm going to go with one more um, buzzword, then we'll get on to some other things. So on the endpoint, we started out with patching. We still have patching. We have antivirus, but then we have EDR, right? Endpoint data. What is it? Data. I'm gonna, yeah, flame me on Twitter. It's good. Too many acronyms in this. And then we have XDR, right?
Yes.
We're doing more When are we done? Like, at what point do we have enough monitoring on the endpoint to be like, yep, we're good?
I think it comes down to if we can take some of the data off the endpoint and store it centrally and minimize that risk component. Ultimately, at the end of the day with the endpoint, as long as there's functionality, it's going to rest on the user. What I always sort of use as the analogy is we can take the safest car on the planet, but if we put a reckless driver and they drive that car 100 miles an hour into a tree, they're going to still get hurt or injure themselves. It's the same thing. We're trying to engineer a solution. And hopefully this is okay to say, because no matter what you do or put in place, you can't secure stupid.
Yep.
I mean, if you're going to have individuals, and most of these attacks that you look at are really stupid things. Somebody gets an email from an executive that says transfer $300,000 to an offshore account, and you do it without picking up the phone or checking. Now, I know some people might get mad at me. That violates some of the common sense. So to me, what it really comes down to is we have to create better processes and systems instead of relying on technology, because we keep well, if we get one more thing on the endpoint, we'll be secure. And really, it's not. You got to ultimately educate the users, minimize the risk, and minimize their exposure points.
So you've been in the business for about 30 years. How many books have you written?
I have my 8th book, Cyber Crisis, coming out in 2 months.
very good. Is that, can I see that, a preview of that on Amazon? How do you get that?
Yeah, it's on Amazon, and actually, I'm so mad at myself because I woke up this morning and I remembered to bring you a copy because I have early release. So I'm proud of myself for that, and I left it on the counter. So I'm gonna have to ship it to you and get you a copy. But yeah, it's available right now for pre-ordering, and I'll make sure you get a copy so you can look through that, and we can hold it up at the next
There you
the
go.
next interview.
So you have 8 books, your eighth book. Have you kept the same publisher all these years? Have you changed publishers? What are the topics you've written about?
I've switched publishers over the years, and I've really made a paradigm shift because my first book came out in 2000, Hackers Beware. And then I had Advanced Persistent Threat, Network Security Bible, Hiding in Plain Sight, all very technical because I felt back in 2000 to 2015, there was a problem with education of technical people not knowing about cybersecurity. It was a brand new field. Not everyone could take all the great training that was out there. So I was really trying to get the technical knowledge to a critical mass. I think that knowledge is there. And what I realized about 3 or 4 years ago is the problem is that the average person doesn't understand cybersecurity. So my seventh book that came out 2 years ago was Online Danger, that was really written for parents, teachers, doctors that just understand the threats, the dangers, the issues that are out there. And that was good. But what I realized is the real problem is that it's executives don't understand cyber because we never speak their language. So this book is a business book written in business language. I had a lot of key business executives review it, analyze it for business professionals, managers, directors, CEOs. They could sit down, read it in a few hours, and understand the questions they need to ask to protect their organization.
So what are some of those questions, and what are some of the misconceptions that people outside of cybersecurity have about cybersecurity?
So probably the biggest misconception that executives or non-technical people have is to have an organization secure, you just have to have a department. So if you have a cybersecurity department with a cybersecurity engineer, you check the box and you have security. And what they don't understand is cybersecurity to be done correctly has to be integrated into your business. It has to be integrated throughout the entire business. The analogy I always use is most companies treat cybersecurity like the icing on the cake. They bake the cake, they bake it, and then the last final thing is, should it be strawberry or chocolate? Should it be IDS or firewalls? And it's too late. To me, you want cybersecurity to be the flour. It's the first thing you put in the bowl. And most importantly, when the cake is done, you can't identify the flour. So to me, cybersecurity needs to be integrated into every process and every business unit.
That's excellent. So I think that's a good segue into something that my wife Cindy and I are pretty passionate about, is expanding the cybersecurity industry to something we're calling data care, to not only make it cybersecurity more people aware that they have a personal responsibility to do this, but also for people who want to join this industry. Most people in our industry looks like you and me, really attractive white dudes, right, right. But a lot of people are, of color. There's a lot of women. There's just a lot of diversity that's not present because they weren't doing that. So we're kind of hoping to include this with this concept of data care. But going back to the well, I guess first of all, how do you react to that? Do you agree with that? Is that cool?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And a lot of people laugh, but I do a lot of keynotes and a lot of free keynotes. And I probably do 4 or 5 keynotes a year at women in security groups.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly, I'm not that. But what they don't realize is I have 2 daughters, and my youngest daughter, who's 15, wants to get into cybersecurity. I never pushed it on them. But what broke my heart was when she was 14 a year ago. She came to me and she's like, Dad, I really want to get into cybersecurity. It seems cool. I really like what you're doing. She goes, but is that a field I can get into because I'm not a man? And I was just like, are you kidding? So that's when I'm like, okay, we need to help fix this problem. So I'm really out there educating. I've spoke to her class and others that, listen, anybody can get into this field. And in a lot of cases, when you look at the mindset that's different between men and women, we need that diversity. So I think that is spot on. And I love that and would fully support that.
So you're also a doctor. You have a PhD in computer science. You did your dissertation in computer security, but you are Dr. Eric Cole. And do people ever go, but are you you know what I mean. Are
Yes.
you a real doctor?
Yeah.
Right. But this goes to professionalizing the cybersecurity field. We have a very young field. You can be a PhD in architecture, PhD in a lot of different things. Basically, a lawyer, you're basically a PhD. We don't have enough PhDs in what I consider in cybersecurity. So how do you feel about our field? Are we getting better? Are we doing a better job building things that can't break and recruiting more people to our profession?
I think we're doing a better job of really starting to solve and understand the problem, but I don't think we do as good a job as recruiting. Because let's face it, I think we're the exception, but a lot of world-class security engineers are introverts. They're not going to go out there and talk or be active, and in some cases they view it as competitive. So I think we need to do a much better job of making it more exciting, showing people all the different opportunities in cyber, and really putting together roadmaps to get there. And I agree with you completely. And that's one of the reasons why, when I created the CISO certification, a lot of people criticized me going, oh, another cert. But I'm like, no, what I'm trying to do is baseline what is the knowledge, saying these are the steps, and then validating that you have that knowledge. Now, you might agree that my baseline is right or wrong, but I'm trying to do that where we need to do a better job for entry level security, mid level, and advanced of, okay, what are the baseline skills and how can we verify and validate that you have those core skills?
Yeah, it's interesting. I get a lot of questions. How do I get into cyber? What programming language should I learn? I'm like, well, you can go into cybersecurity and be a Python programmer. See, you can also go into cybersecurity as an artist, as somebody who can write well, technical drafts person. It's really interesting. But the comment you made about we need to make cybersecurity exciting is really difficult. We had Sid Meier on the show. He created Civilization, a lot of great games. And I asked him, like, why don't we have any cybersecurity games? And he's like, it's kind of boring. And then if you actually step back and you look at what you're trying to prevent, like all of Chinese intel from breaking in, it's a little disheartening to kind of go that. So how are some ways we can make cybersecurity more appealing to people?
I think it's really going in and sort of showing the fun side of it. So one thing I try to do when I talk to high school or college kids or even a lot of these is show some of the fun cases I worked on, where I got to travel to Saudi Arabia and I got met on the tarmac by the prince who picked me up in the limo. Now, once again, does that have anything to do with that? But what it's showing them is that you can get very respected in the field, and a lot of people like that prestige. And then I tell them how we were able to catch attackers, go back and forth. To me, we need a lot more Cliff Stoll
Yeah.
type individuals. I mean, you could say what you want about him, but that dude made cyber exciting. I mean, I saw him speak once where he's running across tabletops, and The Cuckoo's Egg. I still love that book and recommend it to everyone. We need to go in and, even though it's a little fictionalizing, is just show the fun side, the exciting side, and all those different interesting things you can do so people want to go into the field. But the other thing I'm finding with a lot of the young folks is, right or wrong, and I don't necessarily agree that it's all about the money, but I think showing them you can make a lot of money, I mean, in cyber. And that, I think, is where it starts getting excited to them, because most have been trained up. If you want to be successful and make a lot of money, lawyers,
Doctor,
doctor.
exactly. So yeah, so a lot of times my wife and I, when we go out and we speak to these like community colleges or high schools, I'll just ask them, who do you think makes more money, a doctor, a lawyer, or a cybersecurity professional? It doesn't matter what the answer is. I want them to kind of think of that. There's a professional career here where you can go and actually make a big difference, have some lateral movement into other jobs, which is actually a good thing, right? Not necessarily on the malware side, but it's fun stuff. How do you think Hollywood has hurt our industry as far as representing us as, men in hoodies at dark rooms doing bad things?
Yeah, I think a couple things here. One is that they make us out to be weirdos. Like, if you go into cybersecurity,
I'm not a weirdo.
exactly.
I'm wearing Godzilla. I'm 50 years old. I can show you my Godzilla toys. Anyway,
But they also need to see your beautiful family and beautiful house. To me, Hollywood makes it out that, like, if you're cybersecurity, you're going to be living in a basement alone. Like, it just frustrates me, these movies where the cybersecurity guy is living in his mom's basement, eating Twinkies. I'm like, come on, that's not who we are. And then I think the other thing that they do that's really bad for us is they make it seem so simple and easy. Like you just, you know what I mean? And I'm like, no, it's a lot harder and more difficult. So I think what happens is you have a lot of people going, well, I don't want to be the weirdo. I do want to have a social life. And as soon as they get into cyber because it's hard, they go, oh, well, Hollywood made it easy. Therefore, I'm not going to do it. And they give up too easily. So I think it's that misconception factor. And then the other one to me is also the media, where they won't cover what's really happening. I report so many cases to the big news stories. And you know what they tell me, Eric? If it's not over 100 million records, we don't care. So I think they make it sound like if you're only watching the news, that a cyber attack happens once every 2 years. It's a little bit of an issue and then it goes away. I don't think people realize so much work is out there and there's such a huge need.
So when the Navy came out with Top Gun, because that really was an awesome recruiting
Yeah.
video, even though it's a great movie, and I can't wait for Top Gun 2, by the way. Um, what would a movie be that could draw more people into cybersecurity? What are some examples of movies that you thought the hacking was good or the cyber defenses were good? Are there any? Could there be any?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple ways of doing it. One is, I think if you just follow uh, the life of a hacker, sort of do like a Tom Cruise version where you have a kid in school that was maybe getting disruptive because he was too quick and too smart, so he was getting bored in class and getting kicked out, maybe even drops out of high school or doesn't go to college, to sort of de-emphasize that, and then just take them through some of their different career paths and some of that fun stuff. To me, just make it a little more real. I think they've come close. Like if you look at Live Free or Die Hard,
Hmm.
Hackers, I hate to say it because it's like one of the first ones. I mean, it was awful. I mean, once again, weird, strange individuals. I think we need to make a cool theme and a cool way to do that, but make it a little more real and a little more practical for folks. And like, I'm surprised no one's done that. They've attempted, but they always just go over to this crazy land. But I think there's a huge opportunity for a TV show or a movie that really just real life, like there's all these reality shows. If the Kardashians can make all the, why can't we start a reality show on cyber? Come on.
So you mentioned the Live Free or Die Hard
Yeah.
movie, and of course that was the plot where a former head of DHS cybersecurity kind of turns on people because it wasn't.
Yeah.
I can't help but think of Chris Krebs, right? I mean, it's interesting. Having said that, though, there's so many reboots of movies. I would love for them to reboot war games.
Yes.
If they could reboot war games where it's the same plot, but they can feather in all the different types of cyber command, space command, and the different types of hacking, and just make it real, make it more Tom Clancy-ish and less, teenager movie. That might be a really good way to kind of tie our generations together, because that is one of the better hacking movies that's ever been made.
Yeah. It's funny you say that because the two that would come up, I definitely put war games first and sneakers
Hmm.
second. And to me, that one actually was pretty close. So they actually had Robert Redford, who was pretty real. So yeah, if they could come out with a new version of war games and sneakers, yeah, I think that could sort of do the trick to just get the
Yeah.
excitement.
The only fiction in that sneakers thing was when he gets his paycheck and it wasn't a whole lot. Remember the accountant or the teller wasn't too impressed when she handed him
Oh,
the
that's
check, right?
yeah.
Like yeah, no, it's usually a big check,
Yeah.
and that's fun stuff. Very good. All right, well, where can people go to engage you and learn more about you? Said you got 8 books. We can just Google your name and find these books, but where can people go to learn more?
So the best is secure-anchor.com. That's my company website. We have a lot of free resources. Also, we do a lot on social media. I have a show, Life of a Podcast, I do every week. Sorry, Life of a CISO.
There you
That
go.
makes more sense.
Yep,
Life of a
yep.
CISO, that's a podcast on YouTube. So if you just search for ERIC, Dr. Eric Cole,
Hmm.
on that. And that's really the trick. If you go to Google, if you just search on Eric Cole, 3 people are going to come up: a hockey player, a drug dealer, and a security professional. Now, if you can't figure out which one is me, just put in Dr. Eric Cole or Eric Cole Cybersecurity, and you'll get all of my content.
I think that's hilarious. I always thought the Gula name was very unique, and we had the cast of MacGyver on, and the young lady who's on that show was on the Gula Gula Island, which was a like a music thing. And then when we were getting our Twitter feeds and stuff hand out, there's like Gula Tech, which is somebody in Iraq, and Gula is like the Sumerian god of healing.
Oh,
And I was like, "Holy!" He's probably over there like, "Who's this guy over in America?"
yeah.
Doing that. That's awesome. All right, any predictions for either the nation or cybersecurity? We have a new administration. There's a lot of focus on cyber. We're coming out of COVID. All sorts of great things going on. Anything you want to leave us with? Thoughts on the future?
So the prediction, which I hope is wrong, but it seems like the prediction now is with the solar winds and the attacks that are happening, it's all about blaming others, sanctions, and pointing fingers. And I really hope that we get over that quickly and we get to the point where we start having some accountability for companies to implement proper security. We're the only major nation that doesn't have a national law on data privacy. We have a lot of state laws, but not national. Europe has GDPR, there's others out there. So I'm hoping that Congress and the White House can say, okay, the blame game isn't the way to do this. Let's get some regulation in place. I'm not usually a fan of regulation, but I think cyber needs a little help here. A little regulation, a little structure, and a little accountability. And I think then that will also drive the jobs and all the other things that we've talked about.
I definitely agree with that. And I think we need to get away from just reliance on compliance and hunting, even though we're going to be doing this for a long time, and get back to real security engineering. Like, what is the business? How do we secure it? And that's the only way you're really going to protect that data. So I'd be a big fan of that. Awesome. Well, Dr. Eric Cole, thank you very much for coming on. Um, we'll be putting people in the show notes and then your way, pointing to the podcast. Thanks for making the trip up here. Uh, Once again, this is Ron Gula closing out with the Gula Tech Cyber Fiction Show. Thanks everybody for watching.